This was about as bizarre and as easy as it gets.
So the number for me was a number that would allow me to never have to work again.
I feel like we got top.
I went from a sale of $500,000 to in debt.
$192 million.
This is Built to Sell Radio with your host, John Warlow.
Okay, so what are the numbers on your company's dashboard? My guess is you look at your company's revenue and profitability, which are two great metrics to track, but there are another 8 key drivers of the value of your company that go well beyond just revenue and profitability, that are the things that acquirers want to know about. Going and getting your Value Builder score will help you look at your business through the lens of an acquirer. It takes about 15 minutes to do. Go to valuebuilder.com to get your score. So have you thought about what you might buy yourself after you sell your company? I mean, I don't want to debase selling your company into some monetary objective, making it all about the money, but I do think it's worth thinking about what trophy you might buy yourself to commemorate your success. I mean, it can take a lifetime to build a company, and it's important that there's something on your desk or in your driveway or something you can point to as a physical manifestation of the success you've achieved. And my next guest, Zain Hasan, took that to heart. He went out and bought himself a Ferrari. Now, you don't have to buy yourself anything quite so outlandish as a Ferrari, but you should do, I think, something to really remember what you've achieved. Could be a trip, could be a volunteer experience, could be just something that you will always remember to commemorate that success you've enjoyed. And my next guest did exactly that. He started a company called National Insurance Consulting Group, or NICG, in 2014, built it up to a couple $1 million in revenue, good for a spot on the Inc. 5000 list of the fastest growing companies in America. When he figured the company was worth in the sort of 6 to 8 times EBITDA range, because there was a lot of consolidation going on in his industry, he decided that the time was right to strike, and he sold his company. A couple things to be on the lookout for in this episode. Listen to how he got comfortable taking shares as a currency for part of the sale of his company. Listen also to the mistakes he candidly admits to in giving equity to an employee, and how he would use a cliff in future if he was going to share any equity or options with a potential employee or partner. You'll also hear him describe the effects of accretion, or when a big company buys a little company, they can almost never lose because of the magic of accretion. And he'll talk a little bit about that. It's called an accretive acquisition. He worked with a business coach and really found out a nice calculation you can use to figure out when the right time to sell your company is. He'll describe that. And finally, he'll share a few little tasty pearls of wisdom that should be included in your confidential information memorandum, or SIM, which is the document you're going to use, or your M&A professional will use, to sort of merchandise and sell your company. Here to tell you how he did it is Zain Hasan. Zain Hasan, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you were in the insurance business.
I was.
Yeah, you were. Tell me about the business that you started. It was in sort of employee benefits, is that right?
Yeah, so it's really, if you think of insurance brokers, which I know is not the most boring. I mean, it is the most boring probably industry most people can think of, but it's something everybody needs, right? Everybody needs insurance. My specialty and background was I went straight out of college, worked at Cigna Healthcare. And I was working with companies that were working with brokers, but working with companies that were between 25 and 250 employees. And essentially it was around the time the Affordable Care Act had come out. So there was a lot of questions, a lot of employers didn't know what to do. And I'd sort of noticed being at Cigna, there was this misalignment of interest, meaning like an insurance broker, the healthcare costs continue to rise year over year, right? It's sort of becoming an event for most business owners. It's certainly a challenge as an entrepreneur to afford health insurance. And the insurance companies, the brokers compensated based on whatever is good for the insurance company, not necessarily whatever is good for the client. So I spent 4 years at Cigna and then 2 years at Guardian so I could learn everything I could about the industry. And I went looking everywhere for a business model that really aligned to the employer, where the compensation for the broker was on what's the best interest for the client. And there weren't any. So that's what I did. I created my own firm. It is an insurance broker, but it's called a consulting firm because we don't get paid like a broker.
So yeah, what was the business model? How is it unique from a typical brokerage?
Sure. So a typical broker would be, call it, let's say it's 5% of the healthcare premium, right? So as healthcare costs go up, the natural incentive for that broker is to allow it to go up because that's how they're continuing to get raises. Our model was we're going to do a per employee per month fee, and we won't take commissions. It will be a transparent fee. So now that actually gave us the initiative and desire to say, not only are we not aligned to increasing your costs, we also didn't accept bonuses. Bonuses were a huge amount. So there was bonuses based on the profitability of your clients, which if you think about it as an entrepreneur business owner, you don't want to be profitable to an insurance company, right? But the broker, their job is to make it profitable and then to drive more volume. So we didn't accept those bonuses. Our whole model was to really transform an insurance brokerage to make it to where we wanted to be a consulting firm, but the model was we wanted it to be recurring. And we figured if it was based on the employee count, as the business grew, then we would continue to grow recurring revenues. So we had a flat per employee per month. And that way they knew we have no incentive to drive their costs up.
Got it. And so I don't know anything about the insurance business, but my guess is that given that it was a flat monthly fee, it benefited you to keep the premium or to keep the insurance with the same provider. So you didn't have to do all the paperwork or am I getting it wrong? Was there kind of an incentive to switch and shop it around every once in a while?
So that's a great question. Our whole thing was today we look at insurance. And if you think about insurance, you're just sort of like, I'll use the auto insurance example, right? You pay and you got your deductible and then it's like but if you actually use your deductible, then your premium goes up. Right. So what we were doing was that's what I'll call the fully insured model, meaning you're buying insurance. And then there's alternate funding or self-funding, which sort of came out for companies that are 50 employees and up. Our specialty was that. And the reason was what we'll look at is like, you think of the supply chain of how healthcare is delivered. Well, the misalignment I described at the broker level, it occurs at every level of how healthcare is delivered. And healthcare costs continue to rise. That's a deeper conversation. I don't want to, take it down too far down to the details of that. But our model was to say we can help businesses go from paying insurance companies in what we'll call illiquid operating expenses to not only reducing the cost, but they can retain and turn that into where that becomes immediate cash flow. It'll drive EBITDA because we're actually driving in, we're making it a more efficient healthcare plan. We're not usually just keeping it with the same carrier. In fact, we almost always change the carrier and we're developing a 3 or a 5 year roadmap of where we want to get them to be at the end. Because instead of year over year increases, our model is typically driving about a 3 to 5% reduction year over year.
The carriers must hate you guys.
They don't love us. That's for sure. And candidly, a big part was we didn't go on to a bunch of shows to say our business model, because I do know 2 other people that operate similar. Once I did my business, they created businesses similarly. And the carriers wouldn't pay them. Even though they had revenue, they had accounts. But once the carriers found out what their destination was, which was, we call it to try to get them freed of the carrier, then if they found that out publicly, we had to kind of keep a low radar because there's 3.2 trillion. That's 18% of our GDP spent on healthcare. There's a lot of power in making sure things don't change if they don't want it to.
Yeah, for sure. So you did something quite interesting, as I understand it, and you hired a chief operating officer. Can you talk a little bit about what triggered that decision and sort of what stage of the life cycle you were at?
Yeah, so absolutely. And so I started the business, and when I started it, it was bootstrap, and my first 82 meetings were rejections. So
Meetings with who? Like company owners?
CFOs,
Okay.
it was actually executive meetings where I was there to talk about what the value we could provide. And I was by myself. I had my executive assistant, it was early on. And I think I overestimated how easy I assumed it would be because I wasn't in the broker role, right? I was really working at Cigna at the carrier side. And so, but I was joining the broker on a lot of their presentations. The part I didn't see is how you build rapport. How do they get to that meeting? And so, because I was doing the presentation and helping them win cases. So I assumed that must mean it'd be easy for me to start that business.
Right.
That was a big lesson. It was not easy at all. I think probably at rejection 42, I probably would have been ready to throw in the towel. My wife actually was the one who said, no, keep going. My 83rd employer, the reason I hired, he was the New York Times chief revenue officer. And it was randomly how we got connected. But he knew someone who I knew. And essentially, I just solved a payroll problem for a 3,200 employee company. I found them a vendor, nothing to do with healthcare. And he reached out to me and he was interested in how I solved that problem. I saw that he was the chief revenue officer of the New York Times. And I was like, okay, I feel like the biggest issue I have is at the time I was 27. I'm talking to employers and saying, trust me with your $8 million of healthcare spend. So if I had someone that had 20 plus years, he was a West Point grad, who could help. It didn't even matter if he had knowledge of insurance because I knew everything that there was to know at the time about insurance, but I needed that, the credibility that comes with having someone that shows experience. And so I had him come in, and our 83rd meeting was very deliberate, where I had a staffing company business owner interview him, and she became our first client, which was $250,000 in revenue, and 450 employees.
And so, sorry, I get the idea of having gray hair. So he actually, this chief revenue officer of the New York Times, actually joined your company as an employee. Is that right?
Yeah, well, as a partner. Yeah,
as a partner. Okay. Mm-hmm. And how did you guys work out the economics of that? He was obviously giving up a lot of salary and potential earnings. How did you figure out the value he was bringing and what slice of the company he would get? So
that's a great question. And not with in my personal experiences, I should have done a lot more thinking about that. Because when you start, you think, or I was thinking, I just need revenue. My company's probably not worth much. And so, the model was, he was generous enough that he said, you don't have to agree to it up front. He came down, he was from New York. He came down to visit. We closed that deal that day. Right. So for him, the $250,000 first account, that was his first day meeting me. And I shrugged off my shoulders like it wasn't a big deal. It was a huge deal. Right. I drop him off at his hotel and I'm like, don't go. Because he was going to stay and leave the next morning. I said, don't fly out tomorrow morning. He was like, what do you mean? And I was like, just stay for another day. I called the client, my new client, right? And I explained to her because she really wanted him to join the team. She liked him. And I was like, I think everything went well. Can you refer me to anyone? She set up 9 referrals in the next 30 days. He didn't go back home for 30 days. And we wrote 8 of those 9 accounts.
So did he give up his job before he came down to pitch you that gig?
Actually, he was the chief revenue officer of the New York Times about 6 weeks before him and I had first connected.
Okay.
At that point,
so he had left,
retired. Okay. Essentially, that was his plan, was to retire.
Got it. That's helpful for sure. So how did you go back? How did you figure out how to slice up the equity in the company? What he would be getting?
He actually made a recommendation of 15%. And there wasn't a vesting schedule. My personal, what I wouldn't have, wouldn't say I would have changed the 15% as much as I would have had a vesting schedule to make sure it was earned.
For folks who don't know what a vesting schedule is, describe that for folks.
Sure. So a vesting schedule would be if I'm trying to make sure that someone who comes on provides real value. And, at the upfront, it's really hard to get to know to know how well you know a business partner until you're in the trenches with them every day, building a business. So a vesting schedule, what I see typically from personal studying, was that the norm was, it's called a 12-month cliff. So your first year, if I'm offering 10%, let's say, with a 12-month cliff, that means your first 12 months, you're not going to get equity. Once you hit month 12, then you get your first. It's a 4-year vesting schedule, 10%, 12-month cliff. So your first 12 months, you now have 2.5% equity. And then you can do it where it vests monthly or it vests annually, meaning you're gaining more equity each month at that point. The cliff to me is the most, in my lens, is the most important part, because it gives you that 12-month window where, let's say, everything on their resume looks amazing and their background looks amazing. But you find out when you're in the trenches and you're in there and they're not carrying the weight, you're trying to talk to them and it just doesn't seem like it's working out. You haven't already given them equity. So it sort of gives you that trial time period to actually work with them.
How did you learn that lesson? In this case, it doesn't sound like the New York Times guy stuck around very long.
That's right. He didn't. But I actually learned that lesson more so when I was looking to, I was always reading a lot, because I went from corporate as a sales rep to a founder, which is a big change. And I wanted to, I knew I didn't know leadership. There was a lot in my lens, I didn't know. So I was trying to read, and then I was looking up raising capital. And when I read a book called Venture Deals, and in that book, it actually talked about vesting schedules, and the concept of, and just in general about the entrepreneurship and why those work. And I think a part of it was also when he asked me the question of how I was going to lay out equity, I started to Google, how do you lay out equity with a co-founder or with someone, in a startup? And it typically led me down different vesting schedule, like dialogues. I didn't have a good coach or mentor at the time.
So give me a sense of how big you got this company before you decided to sell, whatever metric you want to use for size, revenue or profit or number of employees, whatever.
Sure. So I'll just use revenue.
Sure.
Because our first year, it was a pretty fast ride. I found it in July of 2014, and we were acquired in July of 2019.
Wow. So
it was literally 5 years. It was first year, no revenue, no clients. But then second year, I don't know the exact year over year, but here's where we ended. We were essentially at 2.3 million in recurring revenue. And in 2019, we were number 667 on the Inc. 5000.
Fantastic. That's phenomenal growth, especially without, starting from scratch, right? Where you're totally starting from the beginning. As you look back over that 5 years, would you point to any one kind of inflection point or any one strategic decision that you made that you think made a huge difference?
Yeah, I would point to it. There's a number that I made and didn't make that could have led to huge differences. I would say a big aspect was I had this fear at this point, because once we had built up the chief revenue officer of the New York Times, him and I had built up a client base. I had this fear of what it'd be like doing it alone. And so the moment he came, I remember he came in and he was like, I'm not adding any value. I don't feel like this is where I should be. And at that time, I was so concerned about whether or not, because I hadn't made a real sale on my own, if you think about it, right? I had 82 meetings, my 83rd where he was there. First client, he was there. So from that first year, all the revenue, I was associating a lot more value to his presence. And that whole concept of being able to, a lot of it was, if I would go back, I would say I would have more meetings where I was not bringing him, but it would give me the chance to say, okay, he's got a lot of experience doing meetings. Let him give me feedback and kind of coach me in the process and not rely on the longevity, because we didn't know each other well enough. And I would also say, I would have asked him, what is his long-term goal out of this? Because that was one of the things, it just went so quick and looking for a solution, because we were really in pain in terms of financially. Like, we were either bankruptcy or finding a client. And if we didn't find a client, we probably had 90 days left.
Why would you have asked him about his long-term goal?
It would have helped me get a better understanding from upfront as to what kind of equity stake someone should have and how I should look at it. Like, are they going to want to learn insurance? Are they trying to build something that's long lasting, that's really going to last and be a big enterprise, that was my goal. I wasn't building it to sell. But that's a lot of those questions weren't asked in the beginning. I just didn't have the business maturity at the time.
What did you come to learn about his motivations?
So I think his motivations were pure. He saw there was a lot of value being added. And, I still, to him, we're very close today. I think he's a good guy. And genuinely, he saw I didn't need him. He saw there was a burden. He was very expensive. And he saw it was costing me a significant amount of money. And from his lens, he sat me down and he said, you'll get someone for the same price that you're giving me that has significantly more experience. And when I look back on it now, I think he's right. So but at the moment, I felt like I was crushed. I didn't know how we were going to move forward. You do go forward. I did, in my experience, you do go forward. It didn't feel it wasn't as fun. And I sort of realized a big part of my journey is I do enjoy having someone in the trenches with me.
That's interesting insight for sure. So you say you weren't building to sell. You're only 5 years in and on a really nice growth trajectory, made the Inc. 5000. What triggered you to want to sell?
Sure. So I had been approached. Our industry, the insurance industry, especially the insurance brokerage industry, has a big gap because millennials don't want to join. At least the studies show that the millennials don't want to become insurance brokers.
That's interesting.
And so with that, there's a lot of baby boomers that are retiring, and there's a huge gap of not only skilled workers, but there's a huge gap of future roles that no one knows where those are going to be filled. So multiples, private equity sort of really jumped into this industry about the same time, or about a couple of years before I started my firm. I didn't know that. I was starting my firm because it was what I knew I could add value to businesses. And I wanted to add that value to businesses. But with the multiples coming in, I got approached by a public company in roughly my third year. And they had made an offer and I turned it down. And the reason I turned it down at that time, I did have a coach and a mentor. And at that time, they had said, if you get an offer for your business, this was their advice. And if you say no to that offer, think of it like you're taking a loan out, because I didn't come from money. So it was really self-built completely. So they're like, you're taking a loan out from the bank to buy your business for that price. If you would do that, then it's okay to say no. But if you wouldn't do that, you should really think about that offer. That's
a neat analogy. I've never heard that before.
And so there was a time period where at the beginning at that, I was ready. I turned that deal down and I still wanted to keep growing. 2 years later, I had started another business, which was an HR outsourcing, HR technology, like essentially outsourced payroll, outsourced benefits, all the side of like, if you think of an ADP or a Paylocity or any of these HR technology companies.
Sure.
That we all typically, as an entrepreneur, my experience was I hired my executive assistant. I asked them to become my HR director. I asked them to run payroll. And next thing I know, they know everything about how much everyone's making. And it's pretty easy for them to come up and ask for additional income. So part of that which is the real story of what happened to me. And they were a valued member of the team, but the income request was certainly much higher than what I was comfortable doing. And I was like, man, I wonder how many other business owners, other entrepreneurs would deal with this, because this is an issue. It'd be so nice to have some outsourced company who does payroll really well, because it's not fun to do, and the ROI didn't feel like it was in entering payroll data, and that way I didn't have to worry about anyone seeing how much everyone was getting paid.
So this was the genesis behind this new business, which was taking your eye off not eye off the ball, but certainly spreading yourself thin. Go back to, if you wouldn't mind, the original offer. Can you talk about what the offer was, either at an aggregate amount or on a multiple of EBITDA?
Yeah, absolutely.
What were they offering?
That offer would have been essentially 5 times EBITDA. And it would have been the concept of what they were really looking for is it would have been, with 5 years later, I would have gotten a multiple of revenue growth, because they were saying I'm growing. They wanted me to run a local office. But the biggest aspect for me was I had just hit growth. So like, I didn't see that as attractive or not attractive. It was like, I can't think about selling right now. There's so much I want to get done.
So to be clear, they were offering you 5 times EBITDA for the EBITDA that you were creating at that time. And then
which was minimal to be
okay.
Just so you know, the EBITDA was very low. It would have been pro forma EBITDA, meaning they would have said under our ownership, what would your EBITDA look like?
I see.
And then taking a multiple of that, which is certainly much larger than my real, tax return net income.
Mm-hmm.
And feel free to ask me. I know it's for a lot of people, it's not this isn't the normal language, right? I have this language because of what I went through about pro forma EBITDA, and I'm happy to explain in more depth. But the bottom line, when I look at the number, when I was looking at the number, I was like, it wasn't a big number because we were in growth stage. So I was investing in growing.
Yeah.
We weren't very profitable at the time, not in year 3.
Got it. Okay. So it's a relatively modest amount of money up front, but it sounded like there was some future payment that I'm not clear about. So they not only were going to pay you 5 times pro forma EBITDA, but there was some future payment. What was that tied to?
So that would have been tied to, there were a number of hurdles. If I hit a certain amount of growth, then I could achieve different like ratios of what a multiple of revenue would have been. Okay. So saying, okay, you grow, because they looked at it like you're doing sales, really, you're building your client list. If you can build your client list, well, instead of making the investment up front, because what they were looking at is they're saying, we believe long-term will make it appealing enough where in their minds, they're like, that way you're not feeling like you're forfeiting the future. So they were laying out if you hit these certain hurdles, you'll still get paid really well in the future. But at that point in time, I was, even though the difference between 3 years and 5 might seem like it's not that big of a difference, but I think when you're, and for those that are entrepreneurs, when I was in there every day, felt like I was learning more than corporate would have taught me in a month. Because I had like 8 job titles that I was wearing that weren't formal. But at that time, I had 2 employees. We were 3 people, right? So small number of people. When we sold, I had 6. So it was not a huge, my other company, the HR outsourcing company, had 8 when my insurance agency had 6. So just in terms of the revenue per employee, we were significantly larger on the insurance agency, and by our 5th year, our profitability, our EBITDA, pro forma EBITDA was significantly larger.
Got it. Okay, so that's helpful in terms of why you turned down the first offer, and at that sort of stage. And I also understand why you were tempted to sell, because you had this other business on the side that was growing quickly. But was there a kind of a straw that broke the camel's back that made you proactively get on your front foot and start selling the insurance brokerage?
Yes, there was. So there was a point where I had sold a number of clients, and I had to replicate and truly scale. And I was focused on, scaling meant I had to find a way to train a sales force. So I had my first sales rep that I had hired, and I was trying to train that sales rep in sales. I realized through the experience and extremely credentialed, actually had the experience of being a sales rep, a sales leader, and a sales executive. But benefits is it's almost like from my lens, it's almost like being an engineer, right? You can be an engineer, but if you're going to go sell the services, then you have to understand, you really like to sell it and sell it well. I mean, these are usually multi-million-dollar expenses. So they're not done. The sales cycle is about 18 months for a new client, typically. So it's not done that like in a very short period. You're asking them to fire someone they currently typically like, their insurance broker, in order to hire you. And to get that done where someone else could feel comfortable being able to do it, that scale was going to be when I could actually get sales reps out there. So I wasn't having to do all the selling. And when I realized that that wasn't viable, that the deals weren't going to get sold without me, I started to look for people in the industry, all of them that were very talented, own their own business or had sold their own business. And that's the point. So I sort of reached this point of understanding this business, the insurance agency, was only going to grow as large as I could personally sell and my team could maintain.
And that's, of course, going to hold you back in terms of the value of your company in the eyes of an acquirer, because they realize they've got to bring you along with the deal. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's so right. And that's why there were no deals that, so realistically, the concept of what I would have loved to have done was say you built a company that it's acquired and you don't need to go with it. But that isn't how the model worked. It was the deal I accepted, and I hired an investment banker and went through the whole full process, an auction. And in that process, none of the deals, we had 8 LOIs. All 8 required that I stay on.
What did you think? Okay, that's helpful. I want to dig into that in a moment. What did you think the company was worth? So more than a couple $1 million in revenue, profitable, growing. Did you have a sense of the range of multiple you thought you might be in?
I did. So I'd done a lot of research. There were some organizations and investment bankers that were very specific to this industry. So I knew that based on our size and based on the young demographic is a huge attractive factor where they apply a higher multiple. If the
young demographic of your employees or of the companies?
Of the guy making the sales. They call it the producer or the rainmaker.
Okay.
So if it's a young producer, then that means that their tenure of being able to bring them on board, they're likely going to have a much longer career.
Sure.
And so the multiples what I was looking at were between 6 and 8 times pro forma EBITDA. That's where I was informed that that's what I should be expecting.
And when you say pro forma EBITDA, can you just clarify what you mean versus, of course, EBITDA, for those who may not be familiar with the acronym, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, which is an expression of profit before tax. What do you mean by pro forma EBITDA?
So I mean, if I look at our the kind of immature, we were running business on an immature finance, like we didn't have a CFO, right? So if we're looking at the financials and I was looking at my annual tax return and it said net income of, I don't know, 600, then it's a matter of, okay, I'm running my business, sort of a lot of personal expenses through it. So take all of those expenses that are personal and apply it with the mentality of, let's say I'm not the owner of this company, but the revenue is continuing. So someone else now owns this company. What expenses are still going to apply?
Got it.
And then
we've talked about,
you subtract those out.
Okay. We've talked about that on the show as adjusted EBITDA, and it sounds like it's the same thing. So
yes, that would be
or normalized
exact same
EBITDA.
thing.
Got it. Okay, so take me through the process. You hired an M&A professional to take the business to market, someone who specializes, it sounds like, in insurance agencies. What was that process like?
So there were 2 big ones. I called both. One was much
These
larger.
These are the 2 big ones, meaning the 2 M&A
2
firms?
investment bankers, 2 M&A advisors.
Yeah.
So it was at the point where I had already reached out and I had peers that had sold their firms. So other insurance agency owners that had sold. I had heard and looked up in private equity. It was insane the amount of private equity firms that had entered into this industry. I mean, every big name I'd ever heard of, and the amount of transactions that were occurring where 4 or 5 years earlier, the actual value of a firm would have been about 30 or 40% what the value was when I sold, and they continue to rise.
Wow.
So it's just, and to me, that was just a matter of luck. That, because again, when I started, I wasn't starting knowing I was going to sell the business or even knowing multiples were going to go up, but it was going up really rapidly. And so it became where I was hearing from everybody I was talking to that was, what I guess you'd call them competitors, but it can be a friendly business, especially out of state areas. And a lot of my clients are out of state. So I was hearing from most of my peers had sold their agencies. So I was asking them why, like, why are you selling your firm? And their explanation was the multiples were so high and they'd usually been in business significantly longer, third, fourth generation businesses, that they didn't feel like succession planning or really that there was a way to get a value internally that would compare to a third party, or whether it's private equity or the investment bankers, the M&A advisors. They explain that there's a couple of tranches of buyers that are in this market. The public buyers, then there's the public, like just giant public companies, right? Mm-hmm. So then from there it would be the billion plus. So they are private equity backed, but they're $1 billion in revenue and up. So the stock was a little less risk, would be the concept of that. And then there was the private equity, which were under 500 million in revenue. So stock would have an opportunity and was typically growing at about 15% to 20%. So a lot of these agency owners were saying that they felt they couldn't grow their firm anymore at 15 to 20%. And they sold because the private equity firms were continuing to grow, and they were growing because if you think of this model, and I'll just use an example, the publicly traded markets, they're actually selling it, the values are between 12 and 17 times EBITDA. So if you think of the concept of just aggregating a bunch of insurance agencies, and let's say you're buying at 6 to 8, like the value of my firm would have been, or was, right? Then it would be, well, if they can do it and go large enough in IPO, they know that that's going to drive a significant ROI for everyone, including the investors. And that's the investment thesis. That's the model and the reason they do it. For my model, it was because I had this very distinct other business, but we had almost 90% of our clients were clients of both businesses.
I was going to ask you, is there any crossover between clients from one business to the next? And so how did you stick handle that piece with prospective buyers?
That was definitely the most challenging aspect. I started when I talked to the M&A advisor and I said, I want to lay out one thing. And I told both M&A advisors because I hadn't selected one yet. I said, I have this other business. I've invested a good amount of what would have been my take-home money into growing this other business. It's not for sale. So I asked them, I was like, before we even start this process, I need to know, is that going to be a barrier? And I had all this thoughts in my mind. I really thought about the concept, and my wife was encouraging me to think about it. She's like, this is life-changing. Like, don't do this without thinking about it. And so I really thought about it, and I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, it has to be where the offer lays out that I can still own that other company. Because it wasn't, and from my lens, it wasn't the end game I was hoping for. So I was like, I want to see that end game through this other business. And I saw that almost every client I sold was becoming a client on the other platform. So I saw that as a much bigger opportunity. If I could this is my mentality. It was, well, what if I could get a giant acquirer to acquire the insurance agency? And, then in that process, every client and every, other insurance broker that I would have as colleagues can sell the solution that my HR outsourcing business company provides. And when I said that to the investment banker, I was very confident. And I said, we don't have to sell my company, but if we're going to do it, that's the only way we're going to do it. And one of the investment bankers said, that's not going to happen. And another investment banker said, no problem. We'll make it happen. So it made it pretty easy to choose between the two investment bankers.
Got it. Okay. So you got yourself an M&A professional. What did they do that surprised you in the way they positioned your company? What sort of magic did they pull out of a hat to sort of position you in the eyes of acquirers?
if you were to ask me to put together what they put together this, they call it a CIM, a CIM. I'll call that
confidential information memorandum. Yeah.
That's right. I'll call it an investor deck, or like, because that's really, it was a presentation of the firm.
Yeah.
When I read through that, I was like, oh my God, this looks amazing.
Where do I invest?
Exactly. And I would never have been able to put that together, because that was, yes, it was them asking questions, but they understood the market. They'd done 116 deals in that prior 6 months. So and that's all insurance. They only do insurance.
What was it, Zain, in the CIM, as you reflect now with some time under the bridge, water under the bridge, what was it in that CIM that you were so impressed by? Like what section specifically, what did they say or do that made you think, man, these guys are good?
So a big part was non-generational, meaning it didn't come like money wasn't handed to them. And it was truly self-built, the age, and then the year over year. So year over year, what they consider great sales for a insurance sales rep, or an insurance, they call it a producer, but an insurance sales rep year over year, if you're in the top like 1 to 2%, the top even 10%, I'll say, is between 150,000 and 250,000 of new revenue. I was producing between 5 and 750,000 of new revenue. And so I didn't know those metrics, and I'm seeing as they put it all together in one comprehensive deck, and I'm seeing the hockey stick of the past, and I'm seeing how they laid out our EBITDA, or our profitability hockey stick. And assuming everything stayed the way it was going, it looked like a very scalable business, or at least like I had significant capacity, where at over 2 million in revenue with 6 employees, significant revenue per employee. And it was year over year, our growth. And then you add that into the awards they had listed that we had won, being the Inc. number 667 out of Inc. 5000. And the fact that we had a model where it was disrupting. I don't want to say I shouldn't say disrupting. That's probably a overused word. And I don't want to give myself too much credit. It wasn't that good, but it was very different because our model was saying it was catching attention by actually shortening the sales cycle, because I was saying, I'm not vested to an insurance company's best interest. Mr. CEO, CFO, I'm vested to I only win if you win. And that model, that description, and the way the sort of the numbers lay out, ended up being where when I was reading it, I certainly understood why they were buying my firm. And especially, sorry about that, it's kids. I guess that's one of the perks. I'll be there, sweetheart. I'll be right there. Okay? I love you too, sweetheart. I'll be right there. That is one of the perks of being able to work from home, but I apologize for that.
Yeah, no, it's great. I love it. I love it. I mean, in seriousness, how selling your company, how has that impacted your family life?
So that's great. It's the moment that the company was actually sold and the cash came in, it was it was all of my net worth was tied into something illiquid. So not only did I have time for family, my mental state changed. I went from this mental state where I couldn't really sleep all day, all night. All I could think about was business. And I had tried numerous times to balance work and life. And although I still owned another business, it was so different because I had a financial foundation. I just had 2 kids. Well, my wife and I had 2 kids. And so it was, I think a big part of it was knowing the amount of like the stress goes away, not completely because, I was in a earnout, meaning they required me to stay on, and I would have probably wanted to stay on either way because the compensation, I do have an earnout, which is almost like a second liquidation event if I hit certain goals. But it just changes everything because I didn't come from any money, and having that financial foundation I bought a Ferrari. I bought a couple nice things,
Nice.
and there are upsides and downsides to losing control, but the financial foundation was so important for my family, for my peace of mind. And I've actually slept. I can go to sleep at 8 and not have business on my mind. And I can honestly say that that would have never been able to occur, I don't think.
Fantastic. So let's get into the deal itself. You had 8 offers. What was your reaction when you saw the breadth of what was on offer?
So it was, my business partner and I had a business partner who was relatively early on. He'd been with me for 2 years. So he had a small amount of ownership, but
this is not the New York Times guy. This is a different guy.
No, different guy. But the majority of the business was, and we had most of our personnel was not the same personnel. So the 6 people we had at the end, one had been with us for 3 years, but the only constant factor from an employment was me. And so I was looking at them. I had met with each of the buyers. So the auction process they set up was, they said, okay, we're going to have you initially talk verbally with each one. Then we're going to select 8, and because there were more than 8 to choose from, they're like, we're going to select 8. So I worked with the M&A advisor, gave me their personal opinion on what would fit what I was looking for, and the different buyers that were out there. And then we narrowed that down to 8 that they said, okay, 2 days in a row. It was a hotel. And so it was like 4, essentially hour and a half long meetings each day, which were really the real sales pitch. It was my business partner and I, and we were pitching how we build the business, who we are. They asked us questions. It was less business and more personal, but because they had already seen the information, the SIM or the investor deck had already gone out. So they came with questions that were very specific. And from there, it was really getting to know us, because the insurance business is very highly relational, and they want to know how we did it differently. What did we think how did we think our growth model would look like? And each one sort of asked, so what would it take for us to get to the next step?
How did you answer that question?
Each one had a very different answer, because each buyer was very different. And some I was just meeting for the first time. Others I had known just because I had known of them. But it was essentially, I had a feeling they'd all come in. I didn't talk financials in that meeting, because I was instructed not to. So I sort of assumed that would be done by the investment banker, which is how it was. He handled all of the actual multiples, the details. He handled the entire transaction, all of the interaction with the buyer. And I should have probably said that earlier, but all interaction from lining up buyers, deciding them, and then so he was the middleman for all communication. I think if I had, now looking back, because we've now done a couple deals where we've acquired firms since I've joined the new organization, and I'm a managing director at a company called Risk Strategies, which is the company that acquired my firm. I now have seen how much of a role that investment banker played, because it's so fast that we can decide not to buy a firm based on someone's personality. So he really was, I look back on it now and I joke with him, and I'm like, he didn't treat me like a client. He treated me like he was my boss, and he was telling me what I had to do. But if he didn't, I probably never would have gotten to a deal.
Why? What were some of the things that you would have been tempted to answer and he instructed you not to?
So a lot of the things were around the future growth of the insurance business, and then the future growth of the HR business. And my passion, what I saw, the scale, he wanted to make sure that it was very focused on the value that was going to be provided to the buyer. And we didn't know at that time whether or not the buyer was going to have some type of layout or requirement regarding the HR business. Mm-hmm. So that was one of the things that, although it was in the deck, it just had this one page out of 34 pages, one page that said this other company, and it had the revenue, and that's it. And so it was like, okay, in case buyers wanted to know more, they were certainly going to ask, because it's like, okay, I'm reading 33 pages of this insurance agency, and here's this one page of this other business apparently that they own, and it's the cap table, which is the ownership structure. So each of them asked me, and during that process, I explained, I said, we're going to win more deals because we have that business, but that business isn't for sale because I've invested a lot of money into it. And if you saw the balance sheet and the P&L, you wouldn't pay what I would require. But what ended up happening is all the buyers came back with this mentality, first verbally saying, because when we had the LOIs, they all inclined or implied that they were going to have right of first refusal or something aligned to it. So I couldn't just go sell it to some random person. And then as we got close, once we selected and signed an LOI, it got tighter and tighter and tighter.
What got tighter?
Those provisions, the right of first refusal provisions. And in terms of like, and I understand, because the whole goal is to make sure it's not the value that, the value is also in the clients and the revenue we had. But if I left, this is a people-based business. The goal is to lock me in with golden handcuffs. And because I was pretty stubborn on the idea I wasn't going to sell that other business, it was to make sure that if there was a time where it was going to be sold and there was a buyer coming in, that I couldn't sell equity or I couldn't sell stock or they had to have approval of that. So what they actually did is we restructured a lot of that business. I had to buy out any other investors, and just me and my business partner were the remaining two. So if I look at it from their shoes, they did everything very intelligently. But, if I knew that was all going to happen at the beginning, I may have had I love where I'm at. I may have had a little bit different, more rigorous approach to ensuring I had, before signing an LOI, really discussed what's this going to look like. But I think my investment banker knew that and knew I might not be that easy to sort of trap down and hold down and keep committed. So he managed me, and I would say he got us through the deal. And now going through a deal has a lot of emotion, especially when there's a business partner. There's a lot of emotion on, because the belief I had this belief it was going to be rosy, like exactly what the LOI said is how the deal would end. That's not at all what happened. It ended up really good, but there were issues that were very real that came up. Like we had an employee who left, who took a $700,000 account with him. I'm currently suing the company because that was a violation of his contract. So when you think of that, that's a huge amount of revenue. And that happened in the middle of the deal is not ideal, right? That's like the worst time that can happen. But all of those moments end up at the end, it didn't matter long term because whatever happens there, now I still have the financial foundation. I feel good. We've got a lot of resources and much more capabilities than I had.
So you were expecting 6 to 8 times adjusted EBITDA or pro forma EBITDA. Were the 8 offers roughly in that range?
All of them were in that range.
In that range. And what proportion of the 6 to 8 were they offering in cash up front versus sort of, tied to some future performance?
Sure. So all of it was cash up front, but it was cash or the requirement, depending on the buyer, was 10 to 30% was in stock. So there was no holdback of cash, but it was stock and cash. No one was allowing all cash.
So let me just throw let's imagine you had $1 million of EBITDA. They were offering you let's say they say it was an $8 million offer. Of that, a portion would have been in stock of their company.
That's right.
As an example. Okay. That's helpful. And how did you get comfortable with putting so much money at risk in
stock?
Yeah, because if I'm not mistaken, their stock is not liquid, right? Like
That's
it's
correct.
not a publicly traded company. So what are your liquidation rights around that? Can you sell it?
I cannot sell it. When they recap, then
recapitalize. Yeah.
And for that means when the private equity sponsor changes hands. So usually because the private equity investment is going to come in and on average it's 5 to 7 years. And then they'll sell it. They'll try to sell it to another private equity firm. And so that is historically in our industry, that happens really, really frequently. But I got comfortable because every quarter they use a Big Four CPA firm to do an audit and actually do evaluation of the stock price. So, and I got all that data and prior detail. And we had what was really unique about our buyer that the other buyers did not have, one class of stock. That was one of the most important aspects in order for me to be willing to invest in the stock. And it was the only one that had one class. Everyone else had, a variety of classes of stock.
Right. Interesting. So one class of stock, you had this, I mean, I wouldn't want to say skeptic, but getting paid that amount of money in cash up front, were you tempted at all to just hit the beach and say, I'm out, thank you, but I'm not going to stick around here? If only because my personal expectations, meaning I had the other business, my personal expectations were much larger. To me, it was an early exit. And it was an early exit because I believe those resources would lead to the meaningful end that I wanted through the combination of what I could get there and the other business I owned. So I didn't have a temptation to do that at all. Honestly, I didn't even take a week off. It was like the moment it happened, it was like, okay, day one. It felt like day one of a new life where now almost like as if my parents had money and they'd given me money, I was starting a business type of thing, because it was like, now I've got new goals. I got to get used to what kind of resources we have, but I should probably take a vacation. I still haven't. It sounds like you're chasing, I don't mean chasing in a pejorative way. I mean it, I don't mean it in any way. Just, it sounds like you're aspiring to a goal in the future.
Yes.
Gary Vaynerchuk says he wants to buy the New York Jets. What's your sort of end game?
So it's I want operating. I'll call it economic independence, where I want to have built and I want to own, but not have to be the CEO or run a business that will drive in at least 10 million in operating cash flow to me personally a year.
That's the big goal that you're chasing.
Yeah. And that way. So my outlook is, when I've done that, that means I'll sort of be on like the board, reviewing the financials, guiding the business. But my portion to take home would be around 10 million annually. And it's a big goal. And, if I don't hit it, at least you shoot for the stars, you land on the moon, something like that.
Right.
All right. So I aspire pretty high. And one of the things that has helped has been understanding that, like, I can't expect everyone around me to aspire to that same level. But that's how I've always sort of been. I don't know. I don't have a good reason or explanation for why that number. But it was the concept. I never wanted money to be the reason I didn't do something. But I also felt money won't change me. I am who I am, and money was only going to just going to sort of grow whatever my natural characteristics are. And so for me, it was trying to make sure that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And earlier it was 10 million. Does that mean I have to settle there? No. But like, that is the goal. And I always want to set a goal that might not, a big, hairy, audacious goal, as Stephen Collins writes about.
What was life for you like?
Jim Collins, sorry.
Yeah, Jim Collins. What was life like for you as a child? What were your circumstances? You referenced a couple times you didn't come from money, but just kind of give me a sense of what that was like.
So both of my parents migrated from Pakistan when they were my dad was, I think, 14, and he came alone, no family. And my mom, she came from, I think she might've been 16 or 17. They met at the University of Maryland. I was born in Washington, DC. I grew up in Snellville, Georgia. If you're not familiar with Snellville, it's, no one really is, but it's about 40 miles east of Atlanta. And it was when I was growing up, I didn't know that I'm being facetious, but like, I didn't really know that it was abnormal not to be white, because everybody, I was the only one that wasn't in my elementary school. In high school, now that Snellville is basically an outskirt of Atlanta. It's changed completely. When I grew up, we would drive 4-wheelers down the road to, our girlfriends' houses, or like I was the only one that had a jacked up truck and wasn't, a Caucasian guy down there. So I didn't know the difference because I was welcomed, but my parents had very strict, concept of work, which was anything I want above my absolute needs, I was going to have to work for. So when I was 13, I got my first job at a car wash, and I maintained jobs throughout. So I went to the University of Georgia. I paid my way through college. I had a scholarship but whatever I had to pay for, whether that was room and board or fraternity, I paid for work through working. And I think that was a big aspect of what helped me appreciate the ability, like what I have, because I don't look at it like money is something that's always going to be there, but I'm not allergic to it. I certainly aspire to make it where it doesn't create issues, but it's one of the things where when the money starts coming in, I would look towards adding value to other people's lives with it, and really creating more of a nonprofit that would really have a much bigger impact, because I think there's a lacking education today in society around finance, entrepreneurship, and sort of what I'll call the core values that it takes from EQ and IQ. And I'd really like to start a nonprofit that's heavily focused on that and not have to worry about money at all to do it. So I could really spend my energy on that.
Can you describe what it was like to tell your parents about the sale of your company?
Yes, it was. I actually say I'm more proud of. I felt better about that moment, because when I remember telling my dad, and my dad saw the car, the Ferrari I bought, and he said, "I'm so proud of you that you got this car." Because when I was young, it was always my dream car, and that moment was like, I don't know how to explain it other than it was more fulfilling. The money didn't mean anywhere near as much as that moment did. That he actually was, because my dad worked all night as a security guard, and then during the day he was in college. So like he literally and he spent 33 years at Motorola, and then that's the only place he ever worked. So, he gave me the opportunity to have a little bit more of a risk tolerance than he could have had. And while we didn't have a very luxurious life, I think he gave me the core values that I needed to make sure I didn't let money affect me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure he's very proud of you. And lots to come.
I hope so. It's if as long as I can add value, that's the focus. I don't think it'll come by chasing money. It'll only come by adding value.
Yeah, and you made that clear. I know people are going to want to reach out to you, Zain, and just connect. Is there a good way to do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's best?
So I can just give you my number. It's my office number, and my assistant answers, but they're very good at getting people to me. It's 954-210-5300. And then you can also go to my LinkedIn. So, and it's Zain, Zain Hasan, Hasan. Look me up on LinkedIn. I spend I'm on there a lot. Facebook, same thing. So I'm engaged in social media. And then I don't know what the easiest way is, but I'm happy to provide my email.
Yeah, I think that's probably good. We'll get people to connect with you through LinkedIn. We can put your email in the show notes if you don't mind, and it's easier than audio.
Perfect.
Yeah, that would be great. And look, I look forward to a second round of this interview. I think there's probably more to come in the Zain Hasan story. So I appreciate you spending the time with us today. I
greatly appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad you got to meet my daughter. Right? No, but it was a pleasure meeting you. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I'm a huge fan. I think this show's provided me with a lot of value, and hopefully this adds value to the listeners.
Cool. Thanks, Zain. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thanks for listening to Built to Sell Radio with John Warrillow. For complete show notes with links to additional resources, visit builttosell.com/blog. John is the founder of the Value Builder System. To find out how to improve the value of your business by 71%, visit valuebuildersystem.com. John is also the author of Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You, and The Automatic Customer, Creating a Subscription Business in Any Industry. Connect with John at facebook.com/built-to-sell or on Twitter at John Warrillow, WARRILLOW. Thanks for listening.